Thanks everybody for joining us for our 8th Advancing Tribes Interests at the California Public Utilities Commission webinar. Today we're going to focus on energization, and I'm excited to have you all here today. So if you could introduce yourself in the chat, that'd be great. If you can also change your name, it'd be great to kind of share also what tribe organization you're with. And we'll cover some updates today after introductions. Then bulk of it will focus on the presentation on energization rules and progress made by the IOUs. So this slide, which you can look at your leisure, just explains how we're funded by the CPUC for the training series and other related activities. So I am Josh Simmons, the co-director of the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, Tribal Energy and Climate Collaborative, and I'll let Stephen and Peter introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Moss. I'm a partner with M-Cubed, and I'll be presenting the bulk of the energization presentation today. Happy to be here.
And I'm Peter Allen. I'm an attorney and former administrative law judge with the PUC, doing work for TECC SCTCA.
Great, thank you. Again, if you could introduce yourself in the chat, that would be wonderful. And we appreciate you joining us here today. So just the kind of same overview we provide, the Tribal Energy and Climate Collaborative is a program under the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. There are 3 program areas. This particular effort and program is under the Policy and Regulatory Advocacy Program. So some updates on some of the efforts of TECC in this realm before we progress or before we move on to the full presentation. We are still working on it's actually self-generation incentive program proposed decision. So we've been working on petitioning the CPUC to extend the rebate deadlines for energy storage rebates for tribal and non-tribal, non-residential projects under the equity resiliency budget. And as of right now, no change has been made to the decision. We are pushing really hard for the CPUC to remove a requirement that projects that had proceeded based on NEM 2 status for solar be able to maintain that status. Currently, the rule proposes to require them to transition if they accept the additional extensions. And again, we're hoping that we're going to be successful with that. It's currently on the agenda for decision on Thursday, and I guess we shall see whether or not what happens then. And hopefully you all are aware of the CPUC's Tribal Order Instituting rulemaking. We brought this up last time. There was a ruling issue seeking comments on modifications to the CPUC's tribal consultation policy, as well as the tribal land transfer policy. The ruling had a series of questions that go well beyond the tribal consultation policy and land transfer policy. And so I think this is an important one that all tribes should be monitoring, be aware of, and be weighing in on. TECC, on behalf of SCTCA member tribes, is working on a draft comment letter right now. We intend to file that on Friday, which is the deadline for the comments, and then there'll be a reply period after that. And then I guess related to that too, just for your awareness, TECC is going to be hosting and convening with the CPUC, Energy Commission, IOUs, and others. Like the governor's office will be inviting the governor's office to join us as well to discuss some of the topics covered by the tribal OIR, but really some priority topics impacting tribes, one of which maybe the top issue is energization. So delays in tribes and getting new electric hookups for homes and buildings and facilities has been one that's been identified by a number of SCTCA member tribes. And so we're going to be convening in person. We may be inviting non-SCTCA tribes. We have not sorted out the agenda or even the date for that yet. But if we will be sure to notify anybody on our email lists of that opportunity to be able to speak to the CPUC, Energy Commission, the IOUs, and others about these topics, and hopefully come up with some solutions for these topics too, and at minimum create some transparency that hopefully we can start to gather information on applications for new service or upgraded service or interconnection applications and other challenges the tribes are facing, and begin to actually track data on those and shed a light on them, as well as kind of understand what is supposed to happen in the context of the rules. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Stephen now. As I mentioned, like, this is a top issue that's been identified by TECC member tribes. I imagine tribes across the state are experiencing challenges with respect to energization as well. We want to focus on it today to be able to understand what the rules actually are, what the requirements are of the IOUs, how they are, where they are performing with respect to those requirements. And so I will turn it over to Stephen. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Josh. And thanks everybody again for being here. So I'm Stephen Moss. I work with a firm called M-Cube, and we're working for the tribes on this process. So yeah, today's topic is energization, which turns out to be a lot more complicated than the word even implies. You think of energization and you plug something in and it works, right? And certainly modern society is based upon having available access to electricity. But it turns out, because of the way the utilities do business, it isn't as simple as maybe we want it to be. So if you go to the next slide, energization has been kind of a concern for a long time for a lot of people. The tribes are not alone in deep frustration about this topic. So just to get on the same page, and by the way, anybody who wants to ask a question or clarify or comment, please at any time do so. So energization is about connecting to the grid, to the local distribution system. So at its simplest form, it's if there's a pole outside your house, getting the wire from the pole to your house. If there's not a pole, getting a pole to your house to the wire, right? So each step of the way, there's a different piece of it. It's different than interconnection. Interconnection is attaching facilities that generate or maybe speak back and forth to the grid, including electric vehicles. And that is handled differently by the utilities and by the commission. Even before we started talking about energization as a kind of a policy issue, there have been tariff rules that cover how one goes about being eligible to have a line extension, a distribution attachment to a resident. And those rules kind of stipulate how much it's going to cost you or whatever group of customers it wants it to have happen, or whether the utility itself and all ratepayers will take on the expense of that hookup. There's separate rules for electric vehicle infrastructure, and there's another set of rules for kind of bigger distribution capacity projects. So essentially, there's rules at every level of the energization and interconnection pathway, and they tend to be broken up into essentially size and number of customers that are at issue. If you go to the next slide, and you don't need to memorize any of that stuff. If you were to actually engage in trying to get something energized or interconnected, you'd have to be somewhat familiar with it, but not something you need to carry to you to talk about at lunch. So as I mentioned, energization has been, there's been conflict over the utility's inability to quickly energize all kinds of things, not just tribes, but local governments, businesses, pretty much you name the electrical hookup that wants to be done, it has faced some problems. And as a result of that, there was legislation in 2023 that required the California Public Utility Commission to do something about it. And basically, this is very typical of the way the legislature gets involved in electric utility matters. They don't solve the problem. They require the CPUC to find a way to solve the problem. And sometimes the CPUC is effective and other times less so. And this particular act required that there be more transparency around energization projects and a timeline by which that should occur. Notably, what is not included in here is a specific required date certain. I get to have my electricity from this place to this place for each individual project. It's an average. It also did not provide for penalties if the utilities didn't succeed in meeting any of these requirements. So if we go to the next slide. So and this goes to that, there are no sanctions if they don't meet times. The timeline starts when the IOU approves a request, and it applies to the 3 large IOUs. So you go to the next slide. So I want to go a little bit deeper into Tariff 15, which I mentioned. This is for small hookups, small meaning a household, and it has certain mandates in it that are salient to the speed by which utilities can get things done. For example, for new subdivisions and larger developments, it requires undergrounding. It also does that for scenic areas. The undergrounding is driven by wildfire management and safety generally, but also most customers prefer to have the reduction in visual impact. It talks about the allocation of costs, and it's basically the idea is if there are multiple customers, then the utility as a whole will bear those costs. And then if you notice at the bottom, they've eliminated any kind of line extension subsidies that are what they call mixed use, which is essentially they don't want to subsidize natural gas or propane extensions at this point for climate reasons. Next slide, please, which I believe will probably go over Rule 16. This is more related to specific customers, and I don't think I need to go over this because, again, I don't think this is something that needs to be known in detail, but really just to kind of reemphasize that depending on the customer and the number of customers, under just general rules, utility rules, the applicant's going to be treated differently. So if you go to the next slide. Important to make the distinction because when the CPUC adopted its timelines, it adopted it by tariff. And you see it didn't actually adopt it. It didn't really make a lot of changes by tariff, but it did actually make the distinction. And you'll see is that there's an average timeline and a maximum timeline. Average timeline is among all of the people that have applied to be energized in a given service territory. So it's not your average, or it's not a single customer's average. It is the average of the group of customers that are looking to be energized. That kind of makes it a rolling average, right? Because applications are coming in all the time. It does try to set a maximum timeline. So this would apply to an individual customer. So if it's taking a year or thereabouts, you can see it's a little bit different depending on the tariff or the rule under which the energization is occurring. If it's taking that long for an individual customer, something's supposed to happen. What is supposed to happen? Not clear, but we'll talk about that in a little while. So next slide. These are more timelines. These are maximum timelines. These are larger projects. So if you were doing a subdivision, a community, a development, still there are timelines, and you can see that they can take upwards of almost 10 years to put in a substation. So these are not trivial. Even 2 years for a circuit. A circuit is not that significant of a thing for a development, and so on and so on. So these maximum timelines for the larger projects, I wouldn't say are expeditious, but they do exist. So next slide, please. And this is more of a similar thing, kind of more definitions about what it would take to put into these larger projects. And this proceeding, which finalized with a first phase, is supposed to have another phase in which it continues to develop more refined and hopefully more effective rules around these larger projects, but also around any topic the commission wants to discuss. We can bring topics to them in this phase if it occurs. The second phase has not yet been scheduled or issued, as we've heard in previous of these discussions, like led by Peter. It would start with a scoping memo. There is no scoping memo. Nothing has been issued for us to comment on. And according to the CPUC and talking to them, it's not on their radar yet. So it's unclear when this next phase will occur. Next slide. So here are the steps. And I mean, again, we're getting into kind of a detail on things that is maybe beyond one's need to memorize. But I think it's important to understand, similar to the tariff rules, which are applied to specific cases for reasons, the commission broke down energization processes into steps so that that could be monitored. The purpose of it, it turned out, was that energization, it takes a lot of steps, it takes a lot of different moving parts, and some of those steps are done by the customer, and some of those are done by the utility. So the commission broke down the process of energization into these steps so that they could be tracked. And it starts with the first step is the customer essentially applies for a request. Note that if the customer applies in a way that the utility doesn't deem complete and approved, then the clock average or maximum hasn't really started, right? So the customer has to apply in a way that is suitable to the utility. Then the utility conducts engineering design examinations, depending on the size of the project. If there's a pole there, you just need the wire to go to your house, that's not such a big deal. But if they need to put in a pole, maybe a bigger deal. Goes back to the customer. If the customer has something they need to do as a result of the action, so the utility says you need a new pole, and the customer says, well, I don't have, where do you want me to put the pole? The customer has to figure that out and provide an easement and such like that. And I know that happens on tribal lands and at local jurisdictions, not infrequently for new projects. Goes back to the utility. Utility has to then get its own permits, easements, and such in concert with what happened in step 3. So we kind of already see why this takes a little bit of time if you're not just hooking up a house. Each one of these steps is going to take weeks potentially, or certainly a week, once the intake starts, possibly months, right? So we're getting a sense of how this process works. Go to the next slide. There's another set of steps. There's 8 total, right? So now back to the customer. The customer does kind of talks with the utility, depending on the rule, about how to go about developing the utility side infrastructure on their property or related to their property. Goes back to the IOU, and then things begin. And service energization is the final step of this process, right? So it's a complicated process, and it has to be acknowledged, I suppose, is that the commission didn't really know this, and customers didn't either, right? There wasn't a known understanding of, I call up and I want, my community or my business energized. What then happens? As far as we knew, the paper went into an inbox, and then it was walked to somebody else's inbox, and something happened. Well, now we know it is a bit more complex than that, and now we also are supposed to know where something is in the process. If you go to the next slide. So the utilities, based upon this new transparency as required by the CPUC and forced by legislation, are now supposed to submit reports telling us how well they do, right? So these are happening twice a year. The first one of this proceeding, the first one of all time, so to speak, was submitted in March. And then there was a report in September. And the IOUs are in their reports required to provide the following items. You see there, like how they're doing in terms of performance versus what they're supposed to do on average and maximum, customer complaints and delays, and constraints and obstacles that are in their way. Josh or Amy, I don't know who's running this, but if you want to go to the reports, you can go to the link and you'll see that they're up on the CPUC webpage. And there's a narrative report. If you go down, there's a narrative report. So you see September narrative in Excel for each of the 3 large utilities. And you can take a look at it if you want. You'll see it's not particularly lengthy. It's not that, in some ways, partially informative. And we're going to go over some of the elements in this report as part of my presentation. But they basically give you a round sense of where they are and what problems they're perceiving. And then in the Excel spreadsheet, there will be a table that shows how they're doing in terms of those averages and maximums and such like that. it's an additional bit of information that the utilities now provide, and they're available for people to look at. Interestingly, and we're going to find out, the utilities were not generally prepared for these new requirements, as we're going to talk about in a minute, and neither were the CPUC staff. After the utilities submitted their September reports, it took the CPUC about a month to get them online. And when I talked to CPUC staff about that, they said, well, we didn't really have the setup to do that. I didn't understand what that meant because they have a website, so I'm not sure. But I guess there was some processing the CPUC had to do. So this entire new approach to understanding and tracking data around energization is new to everybody, regulators and the utilities. So if you go to the next slide. So the utilities basically said, we are not very good at doing this yet. And they, as I just mentioned, they were not really prepared to start tracking their data or reporting on timelines and costs and delays. And they were particularly unable to do that for underserved communities and tribal lands. They actually don't track tribal lands separately. And I've asked all the utilities as well as CPUC staff whether they could track tribal lands distinct from underserved communities in general. And I have not actually gotten back an answer. I haven't gotten back a no, but I also have not gotten back a yes from either the utilities or the commission. That question remains outstanding to all of them. Hopefully they'll respond. If you go to the next slide. So this is what the utilities said they couldn't do, which was most of the things they were required to do. They were not able to really isolate, in many cases, those energization steps in terms of the timelines. They weren't set up to do these things, and they weren't doing it, right? So although this is going to sound and has sounded, I think, so far like, well, this is kind of a debacle, it's actually, we're on the road to getting better, and we didn't even know that we needed to go on that road, right? Now we're on the road that didn't exist. It was unpaved. We didn't realize there was this real problem with understanding where things were in the process. And it turns out the utilities themselves did not know where they are in these processes. And they admit it in their reports. And then they identify lots of different problems that they're having, including related to costs. And being able to provide data that will actually meet an ability to averages. We got a question or just a loose thing? If you go to the next slide. They're going to do better. I mean, they've said they're going to do better. They've said that they've had these problems, and they are now saying we're going to solve those problems. I think this is something that we need to be looking out for, which is that they talk about customer portal upgrades, training programs, and stakeholder engagements. And you'll see when we look at individual utilities, they are saying that they are doing that. I don't know whether or not tribes have had that experience, whether there have actually been outreach to tribes around energization and improving those processes. I do know in talking to local governments that there hasn't been much. And when there has been, it is often prompted by the local government. So the utilities are saying they need to do this. They're saying they are doing it. Obviously, we need to make sure that that's happening. Go to the next slide. This is just it's bad news after bad. The CPUC hired a independent analyst, Guidehouse, and they found the same thing. So it's sort of the utilities admitted that they were having problems. Guidehouse confirmed to the CPUC that was the case, and that they were not able to. The utilities were not able to provide the data that was necessary to fulfill the regulatory requirements. Go to the next slide. This is what they found. And we've kind of talked about this. The utilities haven't hid the fact that this is a problem, that there is data problems, missing data, that the IOUs said in their narrative reports that they didn't have confidence in the data validity, and there just wasn't sufficient data. So it's not like there was a sudden finding that, oh, we're doing better than we thought. it was, yeah, we're doing just as bad as we thought we were doing, just as bad as the utilities said they were unable to do. So if you go to the next slide. So now we're getting sort of deeper into this issue of what each of the utilities are unable to do. They can't, this is Edison, and they're not able to track essentially the stages, the different movement through the different stages, or track all of the energization steps taken as a whole. They're not set up that way, right? So it's a little surprising to me that they're not set up to at least track from the moment the application comes in to the moment that the power goes on. I would think they'd be able to do that, but I don't believe that they were collecting data for that purpose because they didn't have to, and they didn't have any internal controls around that. So again, now that they do, perhaps they'll change. Go to the next slide. Can't track timelines, and they're saying they're going to do better, and they're in the process of doing better. Now, the good thing about the reports is that you can kind of track how things are going, both in terms of what they say in their narrative reports and also what they say in the data. How the data is being filled in. I did look a little bit at the June and the September reports, and there just seemed to be some modest improvement. I then asked CPUC staff specifically and San Diego staff specifically whether or not they had made improvements, and neither could answer the question or haven't answered the question yet. So it's a little bit like the other question I asked the CPUC about tribal land data. They haven't said no. They just haven't answered the question. So I think we're in the process of trying to figure things out, and our being engaged in this way is going to help them figure it out, hopefully on our behalf, in a way that makes a difference. Go to the next slide. This is more of the report. So this is, I think this is somewhat interesting data. They are tracking tribal communities. They said they weren't able to define this, and we didn't have time to kind of dig into this deeper. But you can see what they define as a tribal community, their project counts, and the average length of time for energization. And you see that for tribal communities, it's longer than for disadvantaged communities, or for and I don't know why they put non-disadvantaged communities and tribal communities together in another kind of bundle. But basically, the bottom line is, according to Edison's own reports, it's taking longer for tribal communities than other groupings that they have. They did say, and this is a quote, that they did not identify any specific, this is equity or environmental justice related barriers to addressing things. This doesn't quite make sense to me, in that they had said they can't track tribal data specifically, but they're doing something here, right? So we need to understand a little bit better what's going on with Edison in terms of their tracking, and what barriers are caused, if there are barriers, what they are. And here's where, again, everybody on the call can come in, to the extent that there is frustration with Edison about energization, and what they're telling tribal communities is a problem in terms of actually getting stuff done. It would be good if we can convey that to them and to the commission, so that they can start including that in their narrative reports and acknowledging them and acting upon it. So if you go to the next slide. This is San Diego, and San Diego presents things differently a little bit, and you see they're presenting it by tariff rule, and they show us I think some of their timelines. This is before the decision, and they had some ability to track things before the decision. And you see that they were taking a long time relative to the targets, right? For a Rule 15, which is or Rule 16, which these are not complicated projects. Generally, they're not that complicated. It was taking them quite a long time to get to completion. And they needed to do better. So they acknowledged that they needed to do better. If you go to the next slide. Now they're trying to track things in a different way. This is post-decision, and for some reason, they're not able to track it properly. I don't know what happened here. They all of a sudden are missing data. This is the June report. And so they seem to have to try to change their systems in order to address some of the commissions or regulatory performance concerns, and as a result, they were not able to provide any data. It's just, I wish, as somebody who's supposed to be an expert on this, I could tell you why, but I don't know why. And they're not. They didn't say why in their narrative. They just presented this data. You go to the next slide. They do say that they acknowledged, unlike Edison, that tribal nations that can face barriers to energization, and then they identify a series of reasons why that's the case, including identifying the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a possible barrier. And then they talk about these requirements that tribal nations have, in some cases, related to cultural and safety and such like that. Again, this is something that we might want to look at more carefully to see whether these are true barriers, and if they are, whether we want to address them in some way, or whether they're barriers that San Diego is using as an excuse, so to speak. You go to the next slide. More on what they believe to be problems or challenges in working with tribal lands. And here again, San Diego, and I know San Diego is where many of the tribes on this call are situated. They're saying that they're talking to tribal nations and improving their information sharing with tribal teams. Again, if they're not doing that, it would be good for us to compile that and convey that again to San Diego and to the commission and the other utilities, because as far as the commission is concerned, this is what they see, right? They see San Diego acknowledging problems, identifying what they are, and then saying they're doing better, where our voice is not part of this unless we actually make it a part of it, right? And if these are not accurate statements, or if they're not comprehensive statements, it would be good for us to convey that to the commission and to San Diego. Go to the next slide. PG&E has actually been doing a better job of tracking data. It seems to have had a more sophisticated approach to data collection, but you'll see this, and I find this an interesting slide, because you see there's tribal, they've identified tribal on that line that has kind of a crooked line that goes up, and they're seeing longer average energization times for tribal lands than other lands, other things, right? They're according to their data, they're still under the overall average, but they're doing less well for tribal lands. And it is important, again, to kind of note that an average will mask, it might be taking 300 days for one customer to get energized and another 5 days, right? Now you got an average that's mushed into 150 days or whatever it is. And so the average is masking potentially true pain that some customers are facing in any utility in terms of actually getting the lights turned on in any reasonable amount of time. But at least it does show, in this case, kind of a trend. And in this case, the trend would seem to appear that it's getting harder for PG&E in this case to energize tribal lands, and the rest are kind of, we don't see a lot of movement one way or the other on them. Go to the next slide.
Even I'll just point out this too. It's like, if you look at all the other lines, they're kind of relatively smooth. I think it'd be interesting to see what's the data behind this. I bet you there's very few data points here. We have straight lines indicating that it looks like these might be single data points with months between. So technically these are shorter timelines, right? Like this one right here, but I think this is not this sample size lacks significance, I guess, in statistical terms. I think, yeah, anyway, just want to point that out.
That's very possible. It's a great point, Josh. It's very possible that there's just not enough data for tribal lands. I made kind of a superficial assumption when I first looked at that chart that there are more tribes. PG&E is a big territory, but you could be quite right that it's very small numbers. That actually was the energization part of the presentation. I'm not going to turn to something else, but which is interconnection, a little bit different. Do we want to pause and talk about energization, or should I just dive into the interconnection and then conclude?
Yeah, we could pause and talk about, I mean, well, we have some of the questions, I think a little further down. I mean, I guess there's only two slides on interconnection, so maybe we should just cover that and then have a fuller discussion. And so all of you hopefully be prepared to kind of speak up and share your experiences and concerns, and ultimately we can help document and advocate.
Okay, cool. So yeah, two slides. So as I mentioned, energization is kind of a one-way thing where the utility is providing power to a customer, business, residential, data center. Interconnection is really related to kind of the two-way conversation between the utility and an entity that has probably adopted a distributed energy resource item of a kind. It could be solar plus storage. It could be the SGIP projects that we're talking about, or it could be an actual distributed generated thing that's providing power to the grid. And there is an active, and Peter has talked about OIR, Order Instituting Rulemaking, on interconnection regulations. I believe the last time there was an examination of interconnection regulation was something like 2017, like 8 years ago, 9 years ago. And lots of things have changed, particularly around customer adoption of solar and storage and DERs in general since then. If you go to the next slide. We've been tracking this proceeding and I've been talking to other parties that are more deeply engaged in this OIR, and they are in the last presentation I saw that they did last week on where the interconnection proceeding is. They expressed some frustration, of course, we stakeholders always do, but they also said, let interconnection be a warning to you about what's going to happen with energization. In other words, interconnection is a little bit further along in the regulatory policy discussion. Energization just got energized, so to speak. We're just starting to talk about it. And they are finding that interconnection has some deep flaws that we should maybe understand and apply to correcting in the energization world. There's no sanctions in interconnection. So similar to energization, if the utility does not comply with the schedules that the regulators ask them to meet, there are no sanctions. That is a cause of frustration. There's no prioritization of the interconnection queue. That's also true of energization. So there is no explicit decision that we're going to energize or interconnect a rural hospital before we energize or interconnect a data center or a house or business or a cemetery. There's no prioritization other than what the utilities do themselves internally. There has been an assumption in the interconnection world that it is first in, first out. But when we started talking about this issue of prioritization, they quickly came to the conclusion that's probably not true. It's probably not in utility land first in, first out. There's probably other factors that are going into the decision of how fast things happen. And each of these points, by the way, are now points of contention. They're going to be carried into this interconnection OIR. Stakeholders are saying we need sanctions. Stakeholders haven't said yet we need prioritization because they're worried about how we go about doing that, but it's starting to be a conversation. There is no I think this affordability strategy is the more complex, but there's no accounting in an interconnection as to the contribution that a distributed energy resources might provide to the grid. It's considered essentially a cost in terms of Rule 21 in interconnection, when we know that in many cases, the addition of solar plus storage or other assets can provide benefits to the grid, whether it's at the distribution, transmission, or generation level. This is not accounted for. There's a screen related to larger projects. That's that issue, which, unless someone wants to talk about it, we don't need to. And then there's kind of a high application fee that people want to waive. So those are some of the issues in the interconnection OIR. This is an active OIR. As I say, it just started. I think we're probably 2 months, 3 months into it. It's probably a 6 to 8 month process. I believe that ends my formal presentation, I believe.
Right. Peter, you just came off mute.
Yeah, I just had one little thing to make sure people understand. The rules that Stephen was talking about are, as he said, were tariff rules. So if those are utility rules approved by the PUC, they're different than the PUC rules of practice that we had talked about earlier. So if anyone's looking to find the tariff rules, you will find those on each utility's website. So you can look them up as Tariff Rule 16. They're usually not hard to find on the utility's website. But if you're trying to find the tariff rules that Stephen mentioned, you'll find them on your utility's website rather than the PUC website.
Yeah, case in point, if you just Google it for any of the utilities, not just for SDG&E, be able to start wading deeply into this, and probably eyes glaze over pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's one that says, when you were on there, I saw one that said, it says electric rules. And then you click on that, it'll have a list of all the rules. Electric rules down there towards the bottom. Yeah, there they are.
Yeah. So
it's there. So yeah, and it shows when it was approved and so forth. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you, Stephen. Thanks, Peter, for also making that distinction. We know tribes are experiencing issues getting homes and facilities electrified. That sometimes it can take years. I know of one instance of a tribe that got some new housing brought onto the reservation, and they've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for them to be energized, and had to go put them into storage because they're getting infested by pests. It's already been years. So we would like to hear from you. What is your experience with energization and timelines? Are the problems you're experiencing associated with energization, interconnection, or both, or maybe service upgrades? I know that's not necessarily covered by any of these rules right now. What actions and/or information would be most helpful to you in being able to work with the IOUs, with CPUC, and then what else? Is there anything else you would like us to be able to convey to the CPUC and the utilities? Like we're geared up to do so. We're doing it on behalf of tech tribes. We want to be able to raise the kind of broader issues to inform the CPUC and the utilities, and hopefully move the needle on this so that there's some improvement. If you have any questions about anything that was covered today, please raise those here. So I will pause for a moment, because if I don't hear any, I'll be happy to jump in, but I want to offer you all a chance to share your thoughts, comments, or experiences. And it's a small group too, so you're welcome to just come off mute. Any brave souls on here willing to just share any challenges they've been experiencing with energizing homes or facilities? Will.
Thanks, Josh. Well, Josh well knows our challenges. They are a broad range of challenges in electrifying the off-grid reservation. It's the Weepipe Band of Creek Indians, the Weepipe Indian Reservation, principal section of the reservation in the Laguna Mountains, east of San Diego, north of Interstate 8. So we are unserved by no connection to the public electric grid, transmission grid, and no services from wireline, fixed wireless, or mobile wireless telecommunication services. So we've been trying to electrify the reservation for actively for 30 years, but the project actually began in the late 1970s, trying to get rural conductor laid or extended to the reservation. So there's a number of challenges for us. We're not in a served territory either for telecom or for electric transmission. So there's no duty for any provider or carrier to extend services to the reservation. We were careful in making sure there was sufficient electric distribution capability to distribute from the closest rural conductor, which would be unincorporated community of Mount Laguna. That's along State Route 1 or Sunrise Highway. We were, but just because our population is small, the provisioning of electric services to that area is incredibly tight. And I can't see how that serves the community there well, and it makes it tight for us to ensure that there's sufficient capacity to extend a rural conductor onto the reservation. Issues came up like a easement or a right of way to lay the conductor. It crosses public U.S. Federal government public land, Forest Service land, and they are unable to accept a application from a tribal government for right of way for utility. They can only accept it from a utility recognized by CPUC. So, as Josh knows, we're in the process of standing up a tribal utility for that purpose. Our friends at Forest Service wanted overhead instead of underground. Of course, we're in the highest wildland fire risk area, among the highest in the state. So underground really is the only practicable solution. And our friends at the utility are also recognize that generally they don't have the authority to underground services, despite the wildland fire hazard. As far as funding goes, there are funding categories both in federal and state government for electrification, but none of them has had any real funds appropriated to those programs in many, many years. So when we go for electrification, it's very difficult finding actual appropriations to those. CPUC has been very helpful in tribal technical assistance and local area technical assistance. I think that's the acronym LATA. But it's still a very careful justification to the CPUC commissioners that requires commission vote to extend funds that would enable the very high cost engineering and environmental services that need the advance work to the actual construction. If we were funded for construction, and as Josh knows, that type of funding is really hard to find, but really beyond the capacity of most tribes to fund those necessary development studies. And beyond that, our intention is for our renewable distributed generation systems on the reservation, when connected to the public electric grid, would offset and make sustainable the long-term costs of connection to the grid through the feedback or net metering or other tariffs, self-gen available, but the rates for those have made that very challenging. We're still pursuing it, intend to pursue it, but I'm aware that just for even others not challenged by our issues of being remote and rural and off grid, those economics of offsetting costs for grid connection is a challenge since I think 2023, when that program had some significant changes to it. So yeah, sometimes I have a hard time articulating this because we have a huge forest in front of us, and sometimes we lose sight of the individual challenges there are just because it's a big task. So I hope I've described it adequately, and Josh can follow up on anything I may have obviously not stated as important. So thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate that. I mean, that's certainly some significant challenges that we've faces that, you know, you've been facing for decades now. So it's clearly that data point's not included in the average time, or it would skew it quite a bit. But you know, you could think and for WePipe that this is the primary issue for their community. You know, you talked about population, you know, kind of being part of the equation for the utility and providing service, and it's chicken or egg. Like, you know, how do you expand how do you have enough population to be served if you can't get electricity there? So it's, you know, foundational to WePipe for the sake of its community in so many ways. Well, thank you for sharing. Anybody else interested in sharing?
I have a question for Peter, if no one else wants to jump in, which is, does the state have a duty to serve its citizens? In other words, if there is a no utility zone where there are people, does the state have any responsibility there? I mean, this is not attached necessarily to Will's statement, but I'm just curious, like, is there something else?
In general, no. I mean, it's the question would be, what exactly is the utility service territory? I mean, if you look at how the utilities often define their service territory, it includes a lot of areas. And so to me, like the scenario that Will raised, the thing that raised it for me is like, why exactly are they not in someone's service territory? Because if you look at a lot of the maps that are out there, there's no gaps between utilities. There's, you know, Imperial Irrigation District and SDG&E and Southern California Edison, and they look like they're all there. But yeah, you have situations like that where you have tribes and some other small communities that are just not served, and the utility is saying, yeah, you're not in our service territory. You know, if I was still at the PUC, I'd be looking at it's like, okay, well, why is it not in a service territory? And I don't have a good answer for that. But I know I had run into that when I was in ALJ doing some hearings up on the North Coast of encountering, you know, tribal members who showed up at a hearing basically saying, hey, we don't have electric. I know this hearing you're holding is about electric rates, but hey, we don't have electric service, which was definitely an eye-opener for me. And so I don't have a good answer, but the state itself does not have an obligation, in part because it's left up to either municipalities or the investor-owned utilities to provide service.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, Stephen, going back to the slide up here, the response times. Let's see. So is the timeline itself, is the time applied to what the steps in their control only?
No, the entirety of the process. Right. So if the customer, that's partially why they wanted to be able to break those things into those 8 steps, so they could then identify where the blockages were. Right. It's plausible that the customer is the blockage, right? And they're contributing to the lack of action. We don't know. And in going through all of this, it kind of reveals that this is an exercise in discovery, right? Why did they pick 182 days, calendar days, right? Like, we're trying to figure this out. The commission is trying to figure this out without a lot of good information.
Yeah, it seems like there, needs to be some data tracking among these steps, and to isolate what is within the utility's control clearly, so in ways that they can't just shift the blame on the customer, but have them control what's in their control and set timelines for each step instead of overall, because I mean an average timeline and a maximum timeline, that just, it's, I mean, the fact that they don't have any penalties if they don't comply is, kind of means it's somewhat meaningless anyway. So is the intention that there is going to be something more refined and broken down at some point in the future, or are these intended to be the soft, I mean, like, the Pirates of the Caribbean, they're not rules or guidelines. So is there any, even on the interconnection side of things, is there any indication that these are going to become actual rules?
I mean, I just say as an aside to reinforce what you're saying, I sent a package to my daughter in the United Kingdom that was worth $50. I could track that package every step of the way. Here we have things that are worth thousands, tens of thousands of dollars, and people's ability to do businesses and live comfortably, and they cannot track it every step of the way, right? So there's a serious issue here, And as far as whether the commission is going to lean in, I mean, there is this phase 2, and I think that if we I think it's going to take stakeholder encouragement, both in the interconnection and in the energization, to push for further discernment of these things and sanctions. I mean, as I said, in the interconnection proceeding, stakeholders, parties are asking for sanctions be applied if you don't meet the timelines. That's not happening yet in the energization proceeding, but we haven't yet gotten to the next phase.
Yeah, and just to build on that, if the commission does actually adopt a deadline or maximum timeline in a decision that basically says a utility has to complete this by X time, there is essentially PUC actually has existing broad penalty authority for any violation of one of its decisions. So if they have, which I'm guessing this is one of the reasons why there's a breakdown between the utility and the customer responsibility, that the utilities want to make sure that they don't get penalized for things that they want to claim are not their fault. Because if the commission does adopt a decision that adopts a hard deadline, sections 2107 and 2108 of the Public Utilities Code allow the commission to impose penalties. So there doesn't have to be specific penalties provisions adopted for this, as long as there's actually a real firm established deadline in a commission decision. Because then if a utility violates that decision, they're subject to penalties. And the utilities do not like PUC's penalty provisions because they're pretty substantial.
So I'll close out with this, and I apologize. I can't remember if it's Lucia or Lucia. So again, apologize to you. On your question, does CPUC have plans to host an online tracking system for all IOUs and tribes? And she states then gaps can be Lucia. Okay, thank you. Then gaps can be known in the source of delays. I mean, I think that's what's needed. I think there are no plans as of right now to do so. I have not heard anything about that. I mean, I guess I'll leave it at this. It's like, my question is, okay, well, if they don't have this data, how are they keeping track of these things internally to make sure that these things are moving along? So, I mean, that's the question I would be asking as the CPUC, and I think we should be asking as customers. It's like, how are you ensuring that my application, when it goes in, is progressing through all these steps and that it's going from one person to the next? And these are also, I mean, what we need to see more of, is a greater breakdown. Okay, in an engineering design, how many different hands is that going into within the IOU? how many different departments and you know, so what are the dependencies there? So I think there's a lot more that goes into this that's not, you know, and how is that actually being tracked? How those internal handoffs and those timelines to ensure that it is progressing through the system in the way that it should be. Well, I appreciate you all joining us today. So we're going to take a break for the remainder of the year for December. We also have our TECX meetings. We have taken a break in November, December for those as well. We're going to actually resume those in January as well. They're going to be monthly instead of bi-monthly. We encourage you to continue to share information on your priorities and feedback that could help shape future webinars. And then also there is I believe it's been broadly advertised, but there is a 2020, there's a tribal energy planning and efficiency cohort training series that's going to occur for the first half of next year. And we encourage you to register. So please email us if you don't have that information, and it'll be included in the links in the slide deck as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Stephen, for all the detailed information on that. And you know, we're going to continue to press for improvements in these areas, for greater data, greater transparency, and more improvements in getting homes, facilities, buildings hooked up in a more reasonable period of time. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your week.